You ready to start?
Yeah, sure. Let's do it.
All right.
Oh, wow. I got all that up there, too. Beautiful.
All right. So, of all the red team and blue team speakers at BSides Augusta, Georgia, Tim Tomes is the only one that slept in my bed last night.
Wow.
Tim Tomes.
Yeah, the worst part about that is he's not lying. The best part about that is it wasn't the bed he was in. It was just one that he owned. All right, so that works out. Okay. So here we're talking about OSINT for AppSec, Reconng, and beyond. So I think on the program and on the schedule and everything else, it was just called Reconng and beyond. But that was a lie. This is about how it relates to application security, which happens to be my current field. Okay, so who am I? Well, I'm the managing consultant at a software security company called Invisium. We specialize in any kind of software security, whether you're talking about mobile, web, thick clients, things of that sort. Do a lot of source code analysis, do a lot of dynamic testing, do a lot of hybrid, which is a combination of both of them. We also do a lot of SDLC integration type stuff. So you're looking for software security type work or consulting, Invisium's a really, really good option, and I run the commercial consulting team there. I'd be happy to have your business. Okay. I like to consider myself a hacker looking out for users by training. At one point in time, it was developers, and then at another point in time, it's you guys. And basically what it's come down to recently is just anybody that'll listen to me. Right? I just like to talk about it. I like to share my passion. I got a lot of passion for what I do. And so basically anybody that listens, I'm willing to teach. Love to write code. I spent a lot of time writing code, been doing it most of my life, even though I kind of came up through the hacker ranks in terms of where I am as a professional. I've always found any excuse I could possible to write code. Absolutely love Jesus, you can tell by my shirt. And then I also typically drive fast, get lots of speeding tickets. And I talk fast too, so that kind of goes hand in hand. So caution, there are some live demos ahead. About 50% of the talk is demos. Anybody that's seen my talks before knows I do a lot of the Reconng stuff while we're in here. Offensive material is possible. I don't think in this one we're going to see too much of that. I know in past talks there's been a lot of offensive material. I don't condone the stuff that you may see that is offensive. However, preventing it wouldn't be a whole lot of fun because I wouldn't be doing demos, and demos are obviously the more fun part. A lot of fun for you when they don't work because then you get to make fun of me, and then a lot of fun for me when they do work because then I get to show off some cool stuff. If you've seen me talk before, you know that I don't look at Reconng as an independent project. It's not something I work on alone. Right? I maintain the framework. I maintain the API, all the back-end functionality that the framework provides, but it's the community of developers creating the modules that really give it life. And so in this particular talk, I'm going to cover some modules that were contributed to or developed by the folks that you see on the screen right here. So please give them a follow or a shout out on Twitter if you don't mind. This talk wouldn't be possible if these folks weren't contributing their time and code. Okay, so I've been talking about Recon probably, or OSINT, I should say, and Reconng specifically as involved to OSINT for about 3 years now. And through that time, 3 years ago, I was in a much different place professionally. I was doing network penetration testing and a lot of general security consulting, and now solely in application security as a managing consultant. And OSINT's come a long way too. The resources that were available then, some of those resources don't exist now. And then there's some really cool resources that exist now that we didn't have before. So the Recon and OSINT in general has come a long way. But now that I focus on AppSec, I take a completely different approach to how I conduct open source intelligence gathering. And what I figured is a lot of the reaction that I get from Reconng is it's so network focused. It doesn't really apply to my job in AppSec. Or I get folks in the AppSec field that come to me, and that's exactly what they say is, I've played with it, but it doesn't really apply so much to me because I just deal with application security. Well, there's definitely a way to use it in a fashion that helps you there. And I figure I'm already doing that. I've got a pretty decent methodology. I'll put a little talk together, and I'll go and I'll start telling people how I apply Reconng and open source intelligence gathering techniques within the application security realm. And then maybe that'll help out some other folks and make the tool a little bit more useful overall. So what good is OSINT for an application security assessment if you already have the source code? So something like this is actually really relevant to us at Invisium because we have source code with just about every single assessment that we do. We are very bug focused and not so much threat focused. All right, we're out looking for every single flaw that we can find and trying to fix it at the root, which is the developer, right? The developer writing secure code, as opposed to being threat focused, where Recon and OSINT itself is more focused on a threat intel type approach. And so this is a common question that I get. And I'll concede one thing right up front, that the darker the assessment, and that when I'm talking about that, I mean like white box versus black box, the darker the assessment, the more critical OSINT or the more useful OSINT is going to be in that particular assessment. Okay? Now this is not a zero-sum game, right? Because we're ultimately after the same thing, whether you're doing dynamic testing or whether you're doing static testing, because ultimately we want our customers or our clients to make smart, educated, risk-based decisions and fix bugs, right? We want them to fix problems. And also, another thing about that is most of us in the application security community are doing dynamic testing as opposed to just straight source code analysis. Even network security firms are doing dynamic testing of web applications. So a lot of the stuff that we cover here are more on the darker side, so the information is going to be more helpful. But how do we help these companies, how do we help our clients make risk-based decisions? By showing impact, right? Because impact really is the key to making those risk decisions. If the people making those decisions don't fully understand the risk behind the flaw that we're identifying, right, then they're not going to make the best decision possible. So static analysis shouldn't really change how we show risk, right? We can still show impact through vulnerability, through the information we find in OSINT, whether we find that vulnerability through dynamic testing or whether we find that vulnerability through static testing. The only difference is, if we're doing static code analysis, we have more information. We have the capability to provide a more actionable recommendation, right? We can provide code patches. We can provide a better or more educated recommendation on how they can fix their particular architecture to present that flaw, okay? So if somebody doesn't mind, would you read that slide for me? Ma'am, sir, I'm so glad you asked, because that's what we're going to talk about today, okay? But no, seriously, if you've seen my previous talks, you know that I approach a lot of my Recon NG talks in a flow, because a lot of times in network security, you have to have a piece of information before you can grab another piece, and then you got to take that piece and go get another one. So there's really a flow to it. My particular methodology when I approach it in AppSec is not that way. You can do it in any order that you want. So basically what I've done is I've taken the way that I do it in my process, and I've broken it down into categories of information that I'm going to go after. So what we'll do is we'll talk about each of these categories. We'll talk about what we're looking for. We'll talk about why we're looking for that information. And then we're going to talk about how to go about getting that information using a lot of the resources that we have today. So the first category of information we're going to talk about is contacts. So what am I looking for? Well, I personally look for usernames and email addresses, right? And why do I look for those? Well, because certain email addresses and usernames open up certain attack patterns that are very prevalent in application security today. So as far as if you see these down here at the bottom, username enumeration, which is what opens up the capability when we have usernames and email addresses, that there's a user enumeration there, we can leverage that information in combination with these other things, such as no anti-automation controls or weak password policy. How many people here do AppSec assessments? How often do you see the combination of those three vulnerabilities? I see it in just about every single application that I test. Just about every single one. You may not always find username enumeration in, say, like a login page, but typically somewhere in that application, pre-authentication, it exists, whether it's in a registration page, whether it's in a forgot password page or a login page. It's a tough problem to solve sometimes, and a lot of companies accept the risk involved in that. Okay? So you take username enumeration, no anti-automation controls, which is also quite frequent. Very rarely do I see anti-automation controls, and even when I do, quite often, they're not done right. Anti-automation is tough to do right and in a safe way. And then weak password policies, that's something we all deal with. Passwords are typically always weak. I don't think I've ever seen a policy in the past several years of doing application security consulting that had a standard of more than 8 characters. So even if you have 8 characters long with a very large character set, you can still crack that relatively easily, especially in an offline situation. So the combination of those two things, if we have usernames and email addresses, there's a pretty good chance that we've got a win there. Another opportunity, another attack pattern is user enumeration plus account lockout. So somebody tell me what that equals. If I've got user enumeration, I got account lockout, what type of attack can I perform on the particular application? Possibly. To somebody else? User level denial of service attacks, right? All the time. I see this all the time. And another thing that account lockout is one of those anti-automation controls, right? If it's not done properly, it's anti-automation control done wrong, which I see all the time. Account lockout is hard to do right. And if it's not done right, if I have a username, email address, which a lot of times is a username, I can definitely user level denial of service a whole bunch of people. Now, that's not something we always do as testers, but it's a good way to show risk, because the bad guy very well may do that. He may have a reason to conduct denial of service against you. Okay. So how are we going to do that? Well, for those of you that don't use Reconng, it's got a pretty neat feature that I've built into it recently. I've got everything, all the modules named in paths with dashes in the middle, basically the information that you have or the information that you want to get to. And if you do a search -contacts, it's going to show you all of the modules within the framework that result in contacts. If you do, say, search contacts dash, it'll show you all of the modules which take a contact and turn it into something else. So it's all about transforming data, and this becomes a really easy way to search for what you're looking for. So if we go into Recon NG and we do search -contacts, you're going to see a bunch of modules in there. Now, the ones I want to focus on that are new in this particular talk that I haven't had before are the Sales Maple module and the Mail Tester module. Anybody here ever heard of Sales Maple? Not a single hand, and that's pretty much expected because it's a brand new service. Who here has heard of Pwned List before? Should see quite a few hands there. Okay, well, one of the co-owners of Pwned Lists left the company when they got bought out by another company called InfoArmor a few years back. And he went and he himself was in the OSINT field, and he really was bothered by the fact that Jigsaw sold out to data.com, and we lost that really good information resource that was Jigsaw. So he's gone and created Sales Maple to fill that gap that Jigsaw once filled. So now we have a free and open resource where we can go and actually get contact information. Jigsaw was like, we'll give you names for free for companies, but we're not going to give you contact information. He has said, I want open access to all contact information to everybody. Really, really cool service, a really good, regeneration, or whatever you want to call it, of Jigsaw. So Sales Maple is a really good module. We're going to go through with that. And he has specifically told me that I did this for the security community. Right? He saw Pwned List doesn't really cater to the security community too much in terms of making it usable for the public. And so Sales Maple, one of his goals there was to make it accessible to the security community. And the Mail Tester is a module that validates email addresses. So it'll go out, it'll actually look at the email address to make sure it makes sense. It'll look up the MX records to ensure that a mail server exists there, and then we'll actually connect to the mail, to the SMTP server, do a little communication there, exercise the SMTP protocol, and validate if that email address actually is valid. So it's a really good way to now validate all those email addresses we've created using the framework. So let's go ahead and see how those look. Bring this over so my code doesn't get in my way. All right, so opening up Recon NG, we're already in there. Okay, if you do the search -contacts, you'll see all the modules that result in contacts. A lot of them there should look pretty familiar. But let's load Sales Maple. Actually, Sales Maple uses what? Uses a domain, so we've got to add a domain. I'm going to go ahead and use my church's domain because I've done some testing with them, and they actually have a decent amount of information for us to look at. So we'll add domain newspring.cc. Okay, now let's load Sales Maple and run it. Boom. Okay, and it dumps out very quickly. We get first names, last names, and we get some email addresses, right? So we're off and we're on our way. Let's validate those email addresses to see if they're legitimate. Okay, so let's load Mail Tester, and we'll go ahead and run it. And we'll see that we've got some issues coming back for us, right? Unknown response from the mail server, email address did not exist on the server. So not every single SMTP server is going to actually give you the information that email address exists. Okay, so what the Mail Tester module will do is if it doesn't exist and it can confirm that, it'll remove it. Otherwise, it'll confirm it and leave it in there for you. It looks like here they've actually rate limited me, didn't they? Fun. Sales Maple actually has an email validator as well that I'm going to be migrating this module over to their API. For the time being, this one does have a rate limiter on it, but it'll be upgraded probably here in the next couple of weeks. All right, so where are some other places? How are some other ways we can get to our contacts? Well, we can scrape EXIF data from files. This is something I've wanted to do for a long time with Recon NG, but I've just not put in the time or the effort to actually accomplish it. But now I've done it in a thing called Metacrawler, and basically what we're talking about is using Google Docs to find files associated with the domain, pull down those files, look through the metadata, and see if we can find actual usernames within an organization, domain usernames, or just general information about the user that created that particular file. And so I've got a module that I've written to do that called Metacrawler. Let's take a look at what that looks like. And if we look at the options for this real quick, you'll see that it has this option to extract. So reconnaissance, OSINT, typically passive, right? Well, if we're actually downloading files, that's an active maneuver. We're actually downloading files from their servers. So immediately right off the bat, by default, the extract option is set to false, and you'll just see which files are out there. Okay? If you want to actually extract that metadata, set that to true, and it'll go out there and extract it. So we can go ahead and run it first and see what it looks like without it. And we'll see that there's quite a few files that they're hosting on any one of their web servers on that particular domain. And if you'll notice, you've got resources.newspring.com, images. Yeah, it looks like those are the only two hosts that are there. But we search for the whole domain. So you can narrow it down to just one app if you want to, or you can look for an entire domain. But you can get a lot of information back like this. Now let's go ahead and set the extract option to true and run it. And we'll see here that it's pulling some pretty good information from there, right? Sometimes the people who were last modified by. We've got some usernames in there. Got some information about the computer name itself, which is NewSpring in that particular case. So it's some pretty good information coming back. When it says resource not a valid file, what do you think that means? Does anybody want to guess? File doesn't exist anymore, right? You end up getting a 404 or something like that. But in any case, pretty neat stuff. Just added this week. It'll be in the master branch coming up in the next couple of weeks. But pretty useful stuff. Places we can get contacts or contact information. Is it changing up there? Hello? There we go. Okay. So next thing I want to talk about is profiles. All right. So what are we looking for here? Well, social media profiles, right? And I'm lumping everything into social media profiles. If you've got something out there that allows you to create a profile that has some sort of public-facing information on it, I'm just calling it a social media profile. I'll lump it all into that one category, right? And public or private is important. Public, obviously, you can get straight to the data, no extra work is done. But just because somebody has a private profile, typically those are still enumerable. You can enumerate private profiles, but to get access to it, it's typically as simple as just creating an account and asking them to be their friend, right? Pretty simple stuff. I would say that's within the scope of a contract because anybody at any point in time can become friends with somebody on Facebook. So I don't think you're breaching scope there by doing that kind of stuff. Okay, why do we want to do this? Once again, we've got some attack scenarios that this unlocks for us if we have that information. If we have user enumeration, we've got no anti-automation just like we did before. But in this case, say we have an in-band password reset process. How often do we come across in-band password reset processes nowadays for those of you that are doing AppSet testing? The quantity is reducing, thankfully. I think nowadays I'm probably around 30 or 40% of the password reset processes that I see are in-band, which is still bad, but it's better than where we were a couple of years ago. Okay? Quite often what you'll see is what's like the common thing that people use for an in-band password reset process? It's the common method people use. Security questions, right? I got security questions. I'm going to ask you what your dog's name is. I'm going to ask you where you were born. What was the high school mascot, right? Where can you get that information? Social profiles, right? This is stuff that I see quite often. I was asked to do an assessment about 3 months ago for a Fortune 500 company, which was actually inside the top 300. This exact same attack, they had a single sign-on portal that was vulnerable to user enumeration and did not have anti-automation on it. And then within their password reset system, it was all in-band. All they did was ask you some security questions. And what I found is I could just continue to use this user enumeration vulnerability through the password reset process to enumerate all of their security questions. I just took the security questions for all the users I knew about, started looking through the social media profiles, gained access to enough information to reset someone's password. Once I logged into the SSO system and had access to their main portal, they had a built-in system that allowed you to look up the username for every single person within the company. Once I did that, I took that username that user's username back to the same vulnerability, discovered all of his security questions, went and looked at him, logged in as him, then I have access to an admin account. Now, it wasn't his administrator account, but it was the user account of an administrator. But guess where the emails went when you reset his administrative accounts to something else? His basic user account's email address, which I had access to. And so using that particular approach, I was able to elevate my own privilege within their environment through this vulnerability. For those of you that are familiar with some of Rob Fuller and Chris Gates' talk, that's low to pwn, folks. Because if you look at username enumeration, anti-automation, and something like an in-band password reset process, those are all three going to show up probably low, sometimes medium on a report, right? But that got them completely owned. So something to think about. This information can help with these types of attack patterns. So how are we going to do this? Search-profiles got a bunch of really cool stuff in there. So I used to have this thing called the LinkedIn crawl module, which did a really kind of neat thing. It would use Bing to find LinkedIn profiles associated with a company. And then it would go to those profiles, and if those of you that use LinkedIn, when you go to your homepage, you see that little column on the right that says people also viewed. Everybody seen that before? Well, it goes to the profiles, and it looks at the people also viewed. Then it goes to each one of those, and it checks which company they work at. And then it does the same thing to each one of those. And it keeps crawling through, looking at all the people within the also viewed column to find all these people that work for a particular company. Was absolutely incredibly effective. In fact, it's one of the best contact or profile harvesting, well, it's ultimately a contact harvesting module, but one of the best ways to do that. So I recommend you look into it. I had the module developer break that into 3 different pieces. So basically now you have the Bing LinkedIn module that looks and pulls down a bunch of LinkedIn profiles. Then you have the LinkedIn crawl module that does all of the profile-to-profile parsing through the also viewed column. And then you have the one that actually goes out to each of those profiles, pulls back the contact information, and populates that contacts table. So pretty cool stuff. Anybody here ever heard of the NameCheck website? It's a place you can put in your username. It'll tell you all of these different places where your username has been used and hasn't been used. Well, we've had that module for a little while within Reconng, and it kind of gives you an idea to go look where people may have profiles if you knew like their handle, or in some cases their actual name if that's what they use for what they call their handle. Well, Micah Hoffman, also known as Web Breacher, put together this profiler module. He does a lot of threat intel work, and basically he created NameCheck on steroids. Like he's gone through and he's taken all of these websites, some of them, stuff like Ashley Madison, others just social media sites that NameCheck didn't cover, and created a list of several hundred of these that will do that same check, all right? Really cool stuff, a really easy way to enumerate profiles. And then lastly, Facebook directory. Does anybody know, does anybody even see, does anybody know what I'm talking about when I say Facebook directory? This is something I stumbled across. Actually, John Pullen showed it to me. His name is He's Forced Recon on Twitter a couple of weeks ago. I had no idea that this existed. I'm pretty sure most people don't. Anybody seen this before? This is cool, right? You can look up anybody with a public-facing profile. You just find their name and you whittle down in between these dashes until you get down to their actual names. And then you have all the profiles for the people with that name. That's pretty powerful. I didn't know this existed until a few weeks ago. I built a module around it that will go down. It will automatically do all of that searching through you, whittle down to the actual person, pull all of their profiles down, and populate it in the profiles table within Reconng. Very cool stuff. The next step on this one, and I probably won't get it finalized until towards DerbyCon, is I'm going to make it to where it's going to take each of those profiles and confirm that they work for the companies you have in the database. And so that way you have less false positives. But Facebook directory, really cool resource for doing OSINT on folks. Okay, so what do we want to talk about next? Breaches. Right? What am I looking for when I look in breaches? Well, definitely want passwords and username sets. Credentials. Credentials, wonderful to have. Okay, but also breach details. And why do I want these things? Well, first of all, password reuse is rampant, right? How often, I'm sure those of you that are doing pen testing, you see password reuse a lot in your environments, whether you're doing network pen tests or whether you're doing web application pen tests. But even if passwords aren't being reused, they're very handy for pattern analysis, something I actually saw in the last 5 days. If you saw, let's say you did a pwn list dump and you had somebody's password from last October, and the password was capital AUTMN14, what would you try right now? Capital SUMMER15, right? Autumn 14, summer 15. Guess what got us into a Citrix box? Summer 15 on 35 accounts. We only had 35 usernames, and summer 15 worked for one of them. Incredible. That kind of stuff works all the time. So if we can do that type of pattern analysis, see what you were using before, we can make a pretty good guess about what you're using now, and we have a much higher likelihood of guessing what your passwords are. And then as far as the breach details are concerned, why do we want that stuff? Because we're looking for areas of weakness, right? A lot of times, breaches are a result of some sort of web application attack. Okay, so if we can get some information on exactly how you got breached, perhaps we can find some weaknesses that are systemic through your environment or may occur in other applications, because they typically go back to the weakness in a developer's lack of secure coding practices. So how are we going to find this stuff? Well, search-credentials, right? We're looking for credentials here. That's where all of the breach data pretty much lies within Reconng is within harvesting credentials. A lot of these you've already seen. This is the free pwn list module here, which will just kind of give you a yay or nay if that particular account has been breached. There is still the pay-for pwn list modules there. Some stuff that I may not have talked about before that's been in there for a while is the Have I Been Pwned stuff. Anybody familiar with that? The stuff from Troy Hunt? Yeah, great stuff, right? He's got that same type of search where you can search for breach, but he also has this really neat thing where you can search pastes. So he's archiving all these pastes from these different paste websites and gives you the ability to search them. So I have that built in here, a module where you can search these pastes, and it'll come back and show you which paste has that particular string in it. Pretty cool stuff. Another place we can learn about breaches, privacyrights.org, really cool website, and it's updated regularly. It's a great place to go looking for breach information, the actual details I was talking about. Privacyrights.org, here it is. You go down here, and if you want to see, say, when was the last one that was, September 10th, 2015. What was that, 2 days ago? So that's the last time a breach happened. Say I want to see some information on the recent breach. It's got a ton of information in here. They update it. They keep it well maintained. Great place to look for details on breaches if you haven't already been using that. And then another pretty fun one out at Lenny Zeltzer's website. He has this Was Company Hack Search, which pretty much takes a bunch of hashtags from Twitter that are related to breaches and then searches Twitter with the company name or with a string that you give it. Kind of interesting. I've never got a ton of useful information out of it, but it's really quick, and it can give you some quick hits. And then another thing is just do general searching, right? Your search engines can definitely help you in this particular area. Next category of information I want to talk about is technology. So what are we looking for here? Well, we're looking for client and server-side technologies. What's important about that is if I know what client-side technologies you're using, when and if I do find an exploitable vector, I have a better understanding of how I'm going to exploit it. SQL injection, knowing what type of database would be good information. Command injection, knowing what operating system you're using gives me an idea of what files I need to look for or what commands I can actually run. And when we're talking about client-side technologies, you've got these really rich client-side frameworks like Angular and Meteor that are being used nowadays. And if you can determine that those are in use, there's whole other categories of vulnerabilities associated with client-side frameworks that don't exist when you're using software that's just server-side, that's just using a server-side framework. So really important to pull this type of information down. Also, you want to look for outdated software. And the reason that's important to us is because a lot of times that can lead to direct exploitation of the infrastructure without doing any work to find the vulnerability. If we can determine you're using an old version of Apache, we go to CVE details, I think it's .com or .org, whatever it is. We can see right then and there what type of vulnerabilities and whether or not there's publicly available exploit source code, and then we're in. So looking at technology is extremely important as well. So how are we going to do that? A couple places. Anybody here ever use builtwith.com? Basically what builtwith does is they spend a lot of time analyzing headers and pretty much crawling the web, trying to determine what technologies are being used for everything on the .com space. I sometimes have trouble finding things outside the .com space, but within the .com space, they do a pretty good job covering it. I'll show you the kind of information that can lead to. I think I've got it pulled up here. That's the was company hack thing, builtwith.com here. So if we do like NSA.gov, it'll say, hey, they're using IIS-7, right? Do you have a 0 day for IIS-7? Well, hey, here's where you can use it, right? Says where it's hosted. You can kind of get an idea. They're using Azure DNS, so maybe it's something going on there. A little bit about SSL, talks about server-side frameworks, using ASP.NET. So this is a place where you can go get some information there. It's using jQuery, about the client-side and server-side technologies in use. They do a pretty good job of enumerating the technologies that are being used. So it's a good resource to go get that information. Another place you can go get that information, job postings, right? Job postings is on third-party website, monster.com. Look at job postings. You could also look at resumes, or just go straight to the web page and look for something like this, right? Here's invisium.com.careers. If you're interested in a career in AppSec, you could just do that right there and send me a resume. But yeah, so that's a good place to go get it too, right? So the next thing, this is probably my favorite, is going and getting vulnerabilities. So what am I looking for when I go out here and I use OSINT to try to find vulnerabilities? Well, first of all, I'm looking for already readily exploitable vulnerabilities. And those of you that have seen my talks before, you know the information out there exists to do that. I'm also looking for source code leaks that may exist in news groups, forums, things of that sort. And I'm also looking for searchable bugs. And I'll talk a little bit more detail about what those searchable bugs are here in a minute. But why do I want to look for this information? Because this is like no or low, like very low effort vulnerability discovery, right? Somebody else has already done all the babysitting of the scanner. For those of you that have scanned web apps before, it can be painful, right? They log out on you sometimes. They end up getting a ton of false negatives because of that sort of behavior. They got to babysit them, pay attention to them, make sure they're doing the right thing, make sure they're not crawling endlessly, right? So all that work's been done for you by someone that's scanned all these public-facing websites and then made them available to you. So low effort on your behalf. You just run a search. If there's something there, investigate it, and it may be an active vulnerability that you can exploit, and this results in some quick wins, typically. So how do we want to go about doing that? First, dynamically, how do I do it? There's a couple of online vulnerability scanners that I use, PunkSpider and NSAgov. PunkSpider, something I've talked about before. They're scanning everything in the .com space. They may have added a couple of other TLDs. They don't do any governments, and I'm not sure if they do any EDUs either. But they're constantly scanning the internet for vulnerabilities, like active vulnerability scanning, SQL injection, OS command injection, a lot of the stuff we look for very routinely. Then NSAgov is specifically built for the .NET framework. This is also a Troy Hunt product. Basically what he's doing, he's looking for configuration vulnerabilities in .NET. So these are unique to .NET framework stuff. So if you know you've already enumerated that you're dealing with .NET, you can use NSAgov to determine if there's some really quick wins, if there's some vulnerabilities that exist there. Other places you can look are some vulnerability disclosure sites. For those of you that are familiar with what used to be XSS, they are no longer maintained. All that data has been imported and pushed over to XSS Posed, which is basically a crowd-contributed XSS vulnerability website. You just go there, you can search for your domain, see if anything's been submitted for that particular website or host to XSS Post. And you might find vulnerabilities that way. And then, of course, Zone H, which is the interface, what's the vulnerability I'm looking for? Somebody help me out here. When you change the interface to make it look differently. Anyway, those things get posted there all the time. What's that? Defacement. There we go. That's the word I'm looking for. All right, so that's where a lot of defacements get posted. You can go there, search for your domain, search for a host, see if any of your stuff falls within Zone H, and then validate if you've had any defacements. Once again, we can do search-vulnerabilities to find the modules in Recon that apply to these. Okay? Here, notice I marked out target and said the app must be public-facing. A lot of times when we test applications, we're doing it in like a UAT or a staging environment, something not production, so we don't goof up an actual production application, right? Well, as long as the production app is public-facing and one of these scanners has scanned it, that information, in theory, should or could still be valid in the UAT or staging website, because a lot of times that code is exactly the same. Right? So just because you're in one of those internal environments doesn't mean pulling that data for the public-facing version won't help. Something to keep in mind. Okay, for static vulnerabilities, well, how do I go about doing this? This is some of the coolest stuff that I've been doing recently in terms of what's cool to me. Stuff that's actually really helped out a lot and that I don't think is being exercised as much as it should be. And this is the idea that a lot of folks now are hosting their code on third-party repositories like GitHub, Bitbucket, Codeplex, SourceForge, stuff like that. It's not just open source software being stored there anymore. A lot of organizations, major companies, are now putting all of their software there in private repositories. Sometimes they publicize pieces of it, but they're using these places now. Well, this GitRob tool, which I find is pretty cool. Actually, you give it the name of an organization, it will go and it will find all the repositories on GitHub that belong to that organization. It'll pull down all the file names of the files that are there, and it will look for interesting things like secrettoken.rb and things of that sort. Or, what's this file right here? For anybody that uses Reconng. I was looking through the code and I noticed this, and I was like, hey, that's not very nice, because there's one point in time where I accidentally pushed up my the database with all of my API keys in it, and that's it, right? So he's got an actual signature in here to look for people that have pushed their Reconng API keys up to GitHub, right? So it's kind of a neat thing where he's got all these signatures in there. It's built in a modular fashion, but the only module that currently exists is the one that analyzes file names. So this is one of those projects where if you like the idea of doing this kind of online static code analysis, this is a cool project that you can contribute to. Another neat project is this search code, searchcode.com. It's a maturing project. It's pretty new, but basically what he's doing is he's pulling down code for, just a ton of these code repositories. Let me pull up the website here because I kind of want to show you this search code. So if you go down here, GitHub, Bitbucket, Google Code, all of these, he's indexing all of the public-facing repositories for those, and he's making all of that code searchable. And then kind of like Google, he's got these advanced search operators that you can use to really kind of narrow down your search by language, all kinds of stuff. And so using this, we can use a sort of like a dork mentality there, right? To try to find vulnerable or interesting code in projects on all these different repositories. Some of the search functionality here doesn't work really well yet because of the way he's indexed the code, but I've noticed it has gotten better over recent months. So that's a project to definitely keep your eye on, and it's still a place that I go and look on each test. Is it back up there? All right, here we go. Okay, so I mentioned GitHub and Google advanced searching. If I didn't, it was the last bullet there. Well, basically what I'm getting to here is the idea of using Google Dorks and GitHub Dorks to help find vulnerabilities. Right? So GitHub dorking, right? We got two different approaches. Anybody here heard of GitHub dorking? Using the advanced search engine within GitHub to find code vulnerabilities. Probably seen some tweets about it every now and then when a new bug comes out. Everybody's quick to go to GitHub and be like, can I write an advanced search string that'll find a bunch of repositories that are vulnerable to this? Yeah, okay, cool, disclosure. All right, so the way you do this, there's two approaches that I use to do this particularly. One is using that GitHub advanced search, and then the other thing is using Google with the site operator of github.com. Okay, they both have their advantages and disadvantages. One of the disadvantages is that with GitHub, when you use these advanced search operators, it requires at least one just string that has to show up in the code. So if you use path and you're looking for a specific file name, it won't just show you all of those files. You have to list a string that's in there somewhere. In most cases, when we're looking for a vulnerability, there's a string associated with it. So it's not too much of a handicap, but it's one of those things that you have to take into account when you're using it. On the other hand, using the Google site operator makes it a little bit harder to focus on an actual target. So if your target's a domain or your target's a particular organization or repository, if you're just searching Google for it and you're already using the site operator to focus in on a domain, it's a little bit tougher to do that. Now you can, so here's some examples here. The first example is just going to give you every secret token file for Rails within GitHub. The second one will actually allow you to narrow it down to an organization and a repository if you know that information. Okay, so you can kind of do it, but it's one of the disadvantages of using Google. I like them both. I use them both actually. So I refer to the Google Git combination thing as Google Git dorks. Don't quote me on that. I'm not really trying to start a new word thing. It's just something I throw around at work when I'm talking about it. The cool thing about it, one of the advantages to that one is you can do it on more than just GitHub. Right? That applies to Bitbucket. It applies to GitHub. It applies to anything that Google can index. Any of those code repositories that search code is looking at, Google's probably indexing. And so you can look at all those. The downside is I have noticed in looking for the exact same things, the GitHub Advanced Search Engine is more accurate, and it's probably because Google's having to index everything, and maybe it hasn't caught it yet, or maybe it's expired in their index. I don't know how they manage their indexes, but the results of the actual GitHub search are typically more accurate. Okay. And I've got some modules that actually do this stuff for you: GitHub Miner, GitHub Repos, and GitHub Dorks. So what GitHub Miner does, it's pretty cool stuff. You just give it an organization name, and it actually goes through and it pulls down all of the users underneath that particular company and all of the repositories. So now you have the profiles, the GitHub profiles for all of the listed developers for a particular organization. And that's going to become really key here in a few minutes. Also pulls down these GitHub repositories. Now when you go back and you pull down the repositories, you can go in and pull down gists and things like that too, which we'll talk about here in a minute. And then I've got a GitHub Dorks module, which will actually take a pre-built list of GitHub Dorks and apply them to all the repositories you've pulled down. So now within Recon NG, you can leverage this advanced search functionality to try to find vulnerabilities in source code statically without having the source code from them, without ever sending a packet to their environment. Right, now this isn't, a lot of times it's like, well, if I could access the source code, why don't I just clone it locally and scan it, right? Well, what if your target company has 150 repositories? You're going to clone every single one of them and run a source code scanner against them all? If you're on a timed penetration test and all you're looking is for some quick wins, this is a really easy way to get some quick wins. Okay, so it's all about, what's the objective too and what's the scope. I'm just going to skip the demo on some of these because I want to get in the content before the time is up, and the content's probably more important than watching the module just run. You'll be able to do that kind of stuff on your own as well. All right, so the next thing is sensitive information, just sensitive information in general. So what kind of stuff am I looking for when I talk about sensitive information? Well, number one, debugging information. Has a developer done anything and left some debugging information somewhere? Development notes, kind of the same thing. Have the developers for the organization use some sort of third-party application to leave development notes somewhere? And then out-of-band configuration storage. I know a lot of developers will say, well, I don't want to commit my config file with all my passwords and API keys and stuff to the repository. I'm going to keep it over here separately in a gist, and I'll put a basic or no config file at all in the actual repo that gets pushed out. Okay, well, why do we want to do this stuff? Pretty obvious, right? First, we can learn about some applications that may be in private repositories. So if we see some debugging notes, we see some development notes, we might find out apps that are private that we can't see, find out some information about apps that are private we can't see, through just knowledge of their public exposure. Because when you have an organization like that, you can create private repos in GitHub, or you can create public ones, and quite often you'll see a number of public and they'll have a number of private behind the scenes. Getting information about those private repos is important. That's good information to have. And of course, credentials and secret keys that may be in those configuration files. This is something that actually we'll talk about here in just a second. I'll give you an example. So how are we going to go about doing that? Well, first thing that we want to do is look at pastes, right? Pastebin, paste.org, all these different paste sites. Great place to go get that type of information. Extremely hard to actually find the information, right? Most of those paste sites don't have very good search capability built into them, or things are happening so rapidly, like Pastebin only allows you to search for, I think, like the past 300 pastes or something like that. So the way things are moving, if you're not constantly cataloging that information or constantly watching, you're not going to catch it. It's very difficult. So my go-to is gists. How many people here use GitHub gists? I know I use it. A couple folks? Okay. Cool thing about gists, developers treat them like pastes, right? So instead of using Pastebin and all these other places, GitHub is safe. That's where we keep our source code. So let's use gists. Well, the really cool thing about gists is that organizational accounts within GitHub cannot create gists. When a user of an organization creates a gist, by default is associated to his public account. Right? So if they don't understand that, if they're doing, say, some debugging, or they're doing some configuration swaps between them and another developer, and they're using gists within GitHub, that gist is on their public-facing interface, not the organizational account and the access controls that come there, right? So something I've seen recently on penetration tests is I use that first GitHub Miner module to pull down all of the developers for a particular organization. Then I look through all of their gists. I have found passwords. I found database connection strings. I found API keys to third-party APIs, all in their gists because they were debugging stuff or they were keeping development notes there. Definitely some stuff you want to look out for, okay? And another thing you want to look for in these things is you want to search for keywords, the kind of keywords that you would normally search for if you were doing a file system search. Say you had command injection on a server. I want to look for, say, passwords and source code. Well, it's the same kind of stuff you can look for here. Just get a good list of keywords and search through those. And I've actually built a module in Reconng to do that as well. So when you did that GitHub repo module on the previous slide, it would pull down all the repositories and all of the gists that belong to each of those developers you enumerated. You use this little module here. It takes a pre-built list of strings, and it goes through, looks at all of those gists, and tells you if it has a hit there, okay? So once again, we're automating this process of using GitHub to actually find this really, really useful information. All right, and the last thing, I guess, yeah, this is one of the last things. I've wanted to do this since I created Reconng. I've always wanted to scrape Google effectively, and I've not been able to do that. I stumbled across a small little script, and I want to give the guy like attribution, but I couldn't figure out who wrote it because I think I found it on Pastebin or something like that. But it was a guy that wrote a parser for the Google front page that actually works. It actually parses HTML. And I found out what the key was. It's the user agent that you use. If you use like a links command line browser user agent, GitHub gives you the code in a very, very parsable way, right? So by using that user agent, I've now been able to effectively scrape Google in a way that's consistent. I get back perfect results nearly every single time. And so now I've got an effective way to search Google. Now that I have that effective way to search Google, I've been able to incorporate the Google hacking database into Reconng, okay? So this is something I've wanted to do for a long time. The Google hacking database leads to all kinds of cool stuff. There's ways you can find credentials in there, source code, contacts information you can get in there, Excel spreadsheets, different file types, all kinds of stuff. Those of you that have dealt with the Google hacking database know the power that's there. One of the downsides to it, there's a whole bunch of garbage in there too. I mean, there's thousands, I think there's roughly 4,700 different dorks in there, and of those 4,700 dorks, some of them are just meaningless, some of them are old, some of them are stuff people just submitted that don't really make sense or work. So that's kind of one of the downsides to it. The way I've written the module, I'll show you in just a second, we work around that a little bit. But there's lots of sources for dorks. You don't have to use the Google hacking database. Anonymous, a few years ago, published their SQL injection Google dork list, the one that they were using at the time to find SQL injection vulnerabilities in applications all around the internet. You can use your Google dorks with Google, right? You can now use the Google the Google hacking database module to search for your Google strings, and then also custom dorks. I keep myself like a list of 6 or 7 that I use on every single test. It's like I'm going to run these 7 against every single thing, and if it pops something back, I'm definitely going to take a look at it. And there's also the Bing hacking database. Now that obviously won't work fully. Some of the strings will work for the advanced search operators that are common across the both. But Bing hacking database is something you can use with Bing to kind of do something similar. So I do want to show you this real quick. Let's load Google hacking database, show info. And you can see here I got a whole lot of options, right? Basically what it does is I update the Google hacking database routinely. I've got a script that does that for me. When you load this module, it parses it out and divides it by category. So rather than search for all these thousands of dorks, you can just say which ones you want. You can just flag the ones you want to search for. So in this particular case, say I want to search for error messages, right? Because maybe I'm looking for SQL injection. So let's set Google hacking database error messages to true, and we'll run it. And we'll let it go to town. Something I want to show you here, hopefully it happens. Because people are probably asking, well, how are you searching Google without getting the CAPTCHAs, right? Well, eventually, if Google's watching, are you seriously not going to give me a CAPTCHA? This is like the only time they've ever not shunned me. I'll run it again just to make them shun me here in a second. As you can see, I've already got hits, right? Check this out. We've got a hit here for warning cannot modify header information. If we go to this, what are we going to find? I'll show you that here in just a second. If we go to this website, yeah, there's some information in here. All right, these are errors, and then maybe down here there is some pathing information. Home, Capstrana, repo, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, so we're finding error messages that are leading to code vulnerabilities. This is a disclosure of information disclosure, right? I stumbled across this right before I walked in here today, so this is pretty legit stuff. Now, what just happened when this popped up? Reconng is capturing the CAPTCHA request from Google, presenting it to you, and allowing you to answer it, and then it saves the I'm a human cookie, and then it actually increases the speed at which we can search. So, INGSLY, and if it's right, bam, 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 we keep going. So now you have CAPTCHA answering capability built into Reconng. Google can't shun you permanently anymore, which is awesome, right? That's probably my favorite thing that I've added recently, and it was also the hardest. All right, so in a nutshell, that's the kind of stuff that I'm doing when I do open source intelligence gathering for application security. You know, I would hope that, come on, why isn't this working? I would hope that, you know, this is we've talked about a little bit of stuff, at least glazed over some topics here today that you can probably take back with you. For those of you who do the AppSec stuff, you know, I've talked to a couple of you once or twice. I mean, you see some stuff in here that might be useful to you. Even though we do AppSec stuff, OSINT still helps us. We take a lot of this information, we can start connecting it with these attack vectors and really showing some impact to the folks that we're working for and that are paying us to, you know, provide them some actionable information. So what are my final thoughts here? One of the really cool things about everything I showed you today, none of it requires paid-for API keys. That's something that's been a complaint about past talks is, well, the API keys cost a whole bunch of money, and I got to go out and get all this stuff, and it costs. All this stuff is free. None of this even requires you to go out and fetch API keys. If you do AppSec, it's as simple as this. All right. The other thing is help me build out these lists of dorks, whether it be Google dorks, the GitHub dorks, or even the search strings for the gists. Right? If you've got something that you use and you're in AppSec, share those with me. We'll put them in the repository. We'll grow that together. Let's crowdsource it. Also want to give a shout out to the offensive security guys. They maintain the Google hacking database and actually provide it to open source projects like Reconng so that we can do stuff like this with it, which is really cool for them. They maintain all that stuff and does, pretty much for free, and there's a lot of overhead built into it. Also, quick note, if you want any of that expensive like pwn list stuff that comes in Reconng, you've seen it in recent talk or past talks and you really want to tap into that data, but you've talked to pwn list and it's just too expensive, I've got something that I'm coming up with that may make it accessible to everybody in the community. I can't talk about it a whole lot right now because I'm still getting it approved through some other channels. But if it gets, you know, follow me on Twitter. Actually, what I want you to do is send me an email so that I can contact you if and when, if you're interested, I can contact you if and when it gets approved. What I really like to do is take some of that expensive data that pwnlist provides and make it affordable and available to the security community. And then finally, if you like what you see here and you really enjoy AppSec, I'm teaching a course up in Charlotte in the beginning of November, $250 a seat for 2 days of really kick-butt web application penetration testing training. I encourage you to check it out. I've probably over time already by a couple of minutes, but if you're okay with questions. Anybody got any questions? Sure.
On some of your standards, I was wondering, how do you deal with paywalls? If you get a paywall, are you able to get around those?
It depends on what the paywall is. So if the paywall means you have to have a subscription and you're still and it's a resource that has to be scraped, then a lot of times you have to go have your own subscription and then provide your username and password to Reconng, and then Reconng will authenticate and then get to the information and crawl it and scrape it. Same thing with if the paywall is API, then you have to go out, purchase the API, give the API key to Reconng, and then it will use the API to pull that data down.
Like Facebook, to get to the directory list, you have to have their account.
You don't even have to authenticate. I ran into an issue with it today where it shunned me with a CAPTCHA, so I'm going to have to do some trickery with it. That's why that module has not been released yet. It's not been pushed to master branch. I'm going to do some analysis and see if there's a way to integrate that CAPTCHA into the framework so that we can actually use that resource. But even if you can't automate it, it's there for you to use through your web interface, right? And so if you've got some very specific targets, you can drill down and pull out some information on them. So it's there regardless of whether we can automate it or not. Any other questions? Mark?
All right, and Tim, I need some questions from you for them.
I asked questions.
Did you give out prizes?
I know you answered a question at one point in time. You answered a couple of them. And then we had some other people.
All right. Think of a
about
trivia
Recon?
question. I'll come up. So Tim wrote a module called LinkedIn Crawl. It uses a particular feature in your LinkedIn profile to enumerate everyone within the company. What is it? People recently viewed. Okay. All right, here's a rubber ducky for your people recently viewed answer. Okay. Oops, sorry. You got one? Come up with one?
Sure. Anybody want to take a guess at what the what the search string, what the Google search string would look at for the module that scrapes EXIF data or metadata?
What's the question again?
What would the Google search string look like in the background for the module that goes out and fetches files and then searches them for metadata? What Google Advanced Operator am I using? File type? Yeah. Yeah, that one.
Said that? Said it?
Guy in the glasses? Or one of those guys up there.
Okay.
The guy in the glasses. Both of them have glasses.
Right.
Figure it out. All right.
You got another one?
Sure.
You're welcome.
Oh, I'm sorry about that. I didn't put it up there, did I? There you go. Apologize.
All right. One more. So Tim mentioned two modules that will search for the red team manual. Two modules that will search for websites that archive websites that have been compromised. Name one of them. One of the two modules. I had right back there. No,
They archive breaches, but they're not archiving vulnerabilities. Yep, that's it. Punk Spider. And the blue shirt in
who
the
said
back.
Punk Spider?
Yeah, blue shirt in the back.
Okay.
Is there anything
All right.
else?
And no, that's a giveaway. So we got one more talk this evening, and we got some more giveaways at the end of this talk. And we're going to start that one up in another 5 minutes. 5 minutes.
I'm literally going to have to cut out all demos. Yeah, let me turn these off. Crazy. There's a lot of bored people out there. A lot more people will still be here. I told you, man, I've come to these. Like,
so
the BSides, everybody flocks away at like 3 o'clock. Everybody leaves.
man, you got it all.